Hey everybody, it's Professor Keegan here with another video lecture for gender and popular culture. This week we are picking up with gaming and a unit called Ludic Forms under our larger unit of analyzing forms of popular culture. Last week I just had you kind of chill and play Gone Home. This week you're finishing Gone Home, and we're going to be picking back up with journaling, as well as another assignment, a midterm that I'll send you an email about. So be looking for that email for me and make sure that you're checking the details in there and letting me know if anything doesn't make sense. I have a still in front of you right here that is from a really kind of famous original NES game, Metroid, which has a really interesting relationship to the history of gender in gaming. If you're familiar with the Metroid series, actually the most recent installment, Metroid Dread, just came out on NES Switch, right? Uh, the main character, Samus Aran, is revealed at the very end of this game to be female, or a woman, which was completely unexpected to players back in the, I want to say, very early 1980s when this game came out. Just illustrating how video games traditionally have been thought of as for men, especially for young men. And there's a real lack of representation in gender diversity, racial diversity in games. That's improved recently, but it was still very much a surprise for a game like this to reveal its main character as a hero, or its hero as a woman, back when it's like home gaming consoles were becoming the norm. So I like putting it as our title screen just because it's an active set of questions, representation, and the role it plays in game worlds. So what do I mean with ludic forms? Now, when we looked at Bitch Planet, I talked about serial and sequential forms, which are forms that tell a sequential narrative and are released in batches, right? So broadcast television is a serial form, comics are a serial form, games are a ludic form. And what we mean by ludic is that they're characterized by spontaneous or undirected play. There's some aspect of games that allow for agency in the user. The user gets to direct how the game functions through choices, right? And through performance of different mechanics. So the whole story isn't just laid out for you to experience passively in a game. You co-create the experience with the media format. So ludic forms allow you to spontaneously make choices within them. From Latin, ludus meaning sport, right? So something important to note here is that ludic forms of pop culture are based on an experience of play, meaning experimental activity undertaken within an imaginatively imposed cause and effect system. If you've played video games, you know there's like a healing mechanic and a damage mechanic and a death mechanic, right? And a save mechanic usually. And these are really basic mechanics tied to narrative and exploration progression, as well as power progression for most characters in games. Games are not the only space that use this. Video games, also sports use these mechanisms as well. So sports are a ludic form, as well as of lots of sorts of toys that people play with in organized manners. The mechanics of toys are different. So if you think about Legos, really the only mechanic there is that you stick them together or unstick them, right? So ludic forms based on play. What is a game? A game is an intentionally constructed mode of play with some qualities that all games share. So at the most basic level, games have a goal, right? To win or beat the game or defeat an opponent or solve a problem, right? They have rules for progression toward that goal. They have a feedback system that tells you when you're making progression or not. You can think about, I'm currently playing Dark Souls 3 and I'm dying a lot. And when I die, that's a sign that I'm getting feedback that, I need to learn something because I've missed something crucial that the game is trying to illustrate to me, right? And voluntary participation. It can't be play if you're forced to do it, then it's work, which is like the difference between labor and ludus, right? So game studies describes play within this set of rules as creating a magic circle around the player that is a temporary world within the ordinary world with its own specific rules. So part of what makes games so immersive is that they situate us within a magic world where the rules of the dominant world are suspended and different rules apply. And we often even have more agency within game worlds than we do have control over our actual lives in reality, which is why games can be so enjoyable, pleasurable, and or addictive, right? So those are the basic qualities of ludus as a mode of cultural production and engagement. Goal, rules, feedback system, voluntary. Okay. So how do these rules get effectuated within a game in terms of design philosophies? Well, play within games needs to be meaningful. It's not, if play isn't meaningful, it's not going to be fun. It's not going to lead anywhere. It's not going to feel like you're progressing or getting stronger or more skilled inside the game. You're just going to be like doing stuff for no reason, right? So games are actually designed to produce meaningful play by asking the player themselves to gain mastery of specific systems that the game tells you are meaningful for different reasons within the magic circle, whether that's collecting pieces of a story. Like with Gone Home, one of the major mechanics in that game is story progression through exploration, right? As you move through this space, you get more story. It's my cat. You get more story as you push further into the environment, touch more objects, look at more print, right? There are moments within that game design when you get told, hey, you're going in the right direction because you get another piece of the story. So you know you're on track, right? So that's meaningful. It teaches you when stages toward progression are happening. Okay. So you're constantly being asked to master systems, even though you might not be thinking about it. So in terms of game design, there are like 4 different basic ways games ask you to master things. The first style is agon. These are Latin names, which is games of pure competition. So if you think of fighting games, those are it's just player versus player or player versus machine or enemy. Those are pretty basic tests of mechanical mastery of systems. Can you do something more effectively, faster, and more in rhythm than your opponent, right? Can you beat them just through sheer competition? Aaliyah is a game basis for things like gambling. Some types of card games where you don't know what kinds of cards are going to come up in your hand, right? A lot of board games use Aaliyah. Turn-based games use Aaliyah, where you're kind of rolling on probability. Die-based games use Aaliyah. So that means you can't just crush your opponent through skill. You have to also have variables working in your favor, right? And there's some amount of chance always at play in the game. 3, mimicry, performance and role playing, meaning you take on a character or you create a character. So role playing games, a lot of action games where you're playing an actual like historical figure or character within an established world. A lot of AAA studio games are mimicry games where you play as Aloy or you play as Kratos or you play as these characters or you play as Jin Sakai, right? You play as these Lara Croft. You play as these sort of like fixed characters that have a backstory. Or you create your own character through character creation in role-playing games, and you play a character that you've made who interfaces with a world that's kind of set up for you to enter and interface with. And last is illness, physical thrills and disorientation, which is an important part of, say, game environments like amusement parks, right? And haunted houses. But it's also really important in terms of horror games, games that set you up to get lost, scared, where you have to find your way out of something, right? Or maybe some of your senses are disabled in the game. And a lot of games will add or mix these properties. You'll have like a mimicry game with some amount of illness, some amount of Aaliyah, right? If you're kind of like crafting in a game, that can be Aaliyah. And then also you might encounter boss battles within a larger game, and those boss battles are agon based, right? So a lot of games use all four of these types in different ways. I'd like you to be thinking about how they show up in the games you play, or if you've only ever played Gone Home, how are they all possibly here in Gone Home? Which ones are more prevalent and why, right? And how does that serve the meaningfulness of the game? Okay, so an important thing to think about is that when a game is good, and of course, this is like a critical conversation. People disagree about whether games are good or bad, right? But we could say a game is well made when the play mechanics match the skills needed to solve a problem in the game, and that problem is made meaningful by the game design. A good example of that is in Gone Home. You know, it's a game about self-discovery. We're kind of moving through this family space. We're learning about the relationships of these people. And we're learning about Sam's journey and Sam's sort of growing queer sexuality. And that is a process of self-exploration. Coming out and coming into a queer identity is a process of exploring and figuring things out, putting things together, piecing things together when you don't have a map telling you how to become yourself, right? Like straight people kind of get a set of instructions for how to be a straight person from their families, but queer people don't. And so exploration in Gone Home is actually, as a mechanic or a thing you are doing mechanically in the game, right, mirrors Sam's process of identity formation. And that critics would argue that makes for a well-designed game because what you're doing mechanically matches the story design. Okay, I'm going to ask you to think about that more later on when we get to the prompt. Okay, so those are the four basic game styles. It doesn't mean all games are just one or the other, right? They can blend them too. For example, in Gone Home, you're playing as Caitlin Greenbrier, so there's some aspect of mimicry. You're also very much engaged in illness because the game sets you up to think it's going to be a horror game. So it's playing with like a lot of cues that there's something scary, right? It's sort of purposely making you afraid of what you might find or encounter in the house. And then there's also some element of Aaliyah because depending on what order you do things in, you could go through the story in different orders, and certain aspects of the story might become available to you before others, depending on where you move in the space. Let's talk about gender. So last week I had you read that Royce article about women gamers and the reasons they game. And this week I had you do a reading about sort of the lack of LGBTQ representation, particularly in game worlds. And what I want you to be thinking about is how gender is like a game that we all play, right? We learn how to successfully perform gender through a sort of cause and effect system, right? Where we get positive feedback or negative feedback based on how we act within gendered schemas. So gender is gamified by just the institutional and social environment around us. What Royce calls another game by real world rules, meaning it's a game that isn't safe to play because there are real consequences, right? So one reason why gender isn't a safe game is because it lacks the quality of voluntary participation that makes for play, right? Gender isn't a game that's free to play. You can play it, but there's risk. There's real bodily and legal risk to playing with your gender in ways that society doesn't agree with, right? So there's a gap between how gender feels in the real world and how gender can feel in a game environment where there's a lot more maybe fluidity, ideally, and a lot less actual material consequence. So one reason why people love to play games is because it allows us to create a magic circle where our influence over the rules of gender is increased. We have more control, whether you're creating a character that has a really cool gender expression that you don't feel safe expressing in the actual world, whether you might want to play a character of a different gender than yours, right? Game worlds really attract LGBTQ people and women, the Royce article argues, because they afford us more control over our systems than we have in reality. So Royce does a study of women gamers to see how different levels of gaming sort of hardcoreness, if you want to call it that, carry different orientations to gender. So what this researcher found was that depending on how these women felt about gender, they engaged with games differently based on sort of their desires around gender in their lives. So Royce identifies a group of women called power gamers who are like really hardcore gamers, spend a lot of time gaming, um, and play games that are more traditionally thought of as made for men to play, right? And what Royce finds is that these women are view games as like an opportunity to consciously play with gender. And that tends to make them interested in games that use agon or mimicry, right? As games where we can really kind of mess with people who assume we have a gender we don't, or we can actually create genders that don't exist, right? In character creation. Moderate women gamers who are kind of hobbyists, tended to play games to increase controls over their environments, the gendered environments they were stuck in. So this would be like playing Animal Crossing. There were tons of women, particularly, who picked up Animal Crossing during the pandemic because it afforded a certain amount of control over the world, the game world, that in real life nobody had, right? And people were like going to each other's islands and trading turnips and doing all this stuff on Animal Crossing because they couldn't in real life. So think about the things women particularly don't have control over, like their family environments, their work lives, their households, their childcare, right? There's a lot of reasons why you might want to play something like The Sims because it gives you control over an entire world when in reality, women often have less control over their lives than, say, men do because of patriarchy. And then lastly, ironically, right, women who didn't like gaming and rejected gaming actually tended to have more conservative gender politics than women who liked gaming a lot. This is kind of an inversion of what we assume because we tend to think of gaming as a very masculine thing, right? And so there's a stereotype that women really don't game, which is completely untrue, by the way. But what we find when we look at the data is that it's actually women who have the more traditional views of femininity and traditional gender roles. Those are the women who are anti-game, precisely because games open up all these questions about gender and performance and embodiment that people who are not interested in gender fluidity reject, right? So it's kind of inside out what you would think. And it's interesting to think about people's motivations for gaming. A lot of people are gaming to consciously kind of mess with the rules of the world in these mechanical and design settings. So what I'm going to have you do, I've shared a link with you right below this video to just a little 8-bit game called Dysphoria, made by Anna Entropy, which is a game about her trans experience. She's a trans woman who makes games. This game runs on Adobe Flash, and so it may not completely complete for you. Like you might get to a certain screen and get stuck. I say play it anyway, just to try it out. I'd like you to, because I think regardless of whether or not you get to the end, like wherever the game pauses you, that really produces a certain experience of the game mechanics. If you get all the way through it, it tells one story. If you get stuck in a certain area, it tells another story. So I think either experience is valuable, but if you get stuck, just know that's the game glitching, okay? I still think it's a great game. As you play it, I'm going to ask you to think about a few things. Why is the game designed this way, right? You will notice the controls feel a certain way, the sounds feel a certain way, the layouts feel a certain way. What kind of magic circle is being drawn around you, and whose experience are you being asked to empathize with, possibly, right? Or at least put yourself mechanically inside of. 2, what problem is the game addressing? What systems are we trying to actually master in the game world or game design? What are the gameplay mechanics and why are they designed like that? And what is the feedback system that you're dealing with in the game? And what aspects of Aegon, Ilia, Mimicry, and Ilnix are you picking up on? Okay, the game should not take long to play. Again, if you get stuck because of a glitch, just consider that the end of the game. Okay, I'm going to pause for 10 or 15 seconds right here in the video, play the game, come back to this timestamp. Okay. Okay, hopefully you've played Dysphoria. Hopefully it didn't glitch out for you, but if it did, just consider the amount you were able to look at. Right away, we can see this game is designed to be crude, displeasing, garish. The color design is super garish and kind of assaults us, our senses. And it's made to be uncomfortable, right? It's an uncomfortable game to play. It feels intentionally crude. Um, And as we move through the game environment, we learn that we're being asked to kind of enter the magic circle of a person trying to access medical transition. So all of the little environmental games we play, little puzzle games, are designed to address the problem of being a trans person moving through spaces not designed for you. So we are trying to master what trans people might call passing through systems not designed for our bodies, our desires, and systems that are policed by people who are not trans, right? So you might notice you're moving through, there's like a part where you have to navigate a bathroom where people are staring at you. There's a part where you have to fit there's this little representation of your body throughout the game that kind of starts looking one way and then becomes like a blob as this person starts going into transition and kind of changing their identity. And then as they come out the other end, they become more formed again, right? And they develop a shield and they can like deflect transphobic attacks and stuff. So even just the player icon, how it changes, tells a story here about progression, game progression, power progression, right? The mechanics are laggy, frustrating. There's a part where you have to literally move a funny looking block through a hole in a wall and try not to touch the wall, and you literally can't do it without failing. Where failure is built in because the system does not accommodate bodies like yours, right? So the feedback system here is teaching us something about the design of the world, the implicit design of the world being for non-trans people, and that harm is unavoidable for trans people. Like you will be harmed. This will be hard. There is a certain amount of invisibilized labor just being trans, trying to move through spaces, right? Just trying to get things. And we do see agon. There's conflict. A lot of these little games we play, there's like stuff flying at us. There's like violence. There's insults, right? There is this moment where we're trying to get stuff from people, providers, and we don't know whether those people are going to let us have it or not. So there's implicit Aaliyah. We are playing a role of this person whose experience we are kind of tagging along with inside a magic circle. And there is illness here, right? There is disorientation as we try to move a changing body shape through these spaces that are not designed for us, right? So this game, as small as it is really geniusly designed to use all four basic game design systems. It has a really well-developed mechanic of sort of trying to move through these really uninhabitable spaces, right? And it's designed to address the problem of structural transphobia, right? In ways that come through really well and that represent the world as super hostile and harsh and hard to kind of deal with when you're going through those experiences. So that's like a little mini game. That's how rich a mini game can be. I had you play a much longer game. For some of you who are more experienced at gaming, this game might have been not that hard to move through. For people who have never played a 3D video game, it was probably quite difficult. So hopefully you all were able to get to the end of it, because it's very important to witness the end of the game when you're playing a narrative game, a game about a story, right? So when we analyze games, which I'm going to ask you to do in the prompt for today, we should consider the following things. What kind of game is this? Is it a narrative game? Is it a role-playing game? Is it an action game? What kind of genre is it using? We haven't talked about genre too much in class yet, but there are these typified sort of story and environmental structures in pop culture, like the rom-com, historical drama, the horror movie, right? Where they have sort of like typical scenarios that come up over and over again. And the pleasure of genre is that it offers something that seems familiar, but then there's always a kind of new take on that formula. It's like a narrative and aesthetic formula that's constantly sort of changing and commenting on itself. Gone Home is it is a game in which you're playing a character, so it's a performance game. It's also an exploration game. It's a narrative game, and it sells itself starting out as a horror game. Now, one of my questions to you is like, is this a horror game? And if so, what's the source of horror? Like, what is the scary thing, right? That's constantly kind of lurking around, we never really encounter, but it's there in the house with us. Okay. So, what kind of game is this? What is it doing? What is its type? What is its genre? What are the mechanics of the game? Again, Gone Home is a game in which you move through spaces and you look at items, right? So it's item collection and it's storytelling told through item discovery. So you have to put the story together yourself by reading and listening to what you find. So it's a game in which exploration is the main mechanic. Also, turning on lights. I really hope you started the game with the lights off and turned them on one by one. First of all, super crucial to not getting lost. Ironically, if you start with them all on, you won't know where you've been. So less light is better than all light at the beginning. You might have discovered that. But turning on lights is also a really important mechanic in this game that has symbolic meaning. So be thinking about discovery, item collection, the opening up of closed spaces like closets, drawers, cupboards, and turning on lights. How are these all maybe thematically or even mechanically related to the game themes, and particularly how they're connected to gender and sexuality, right, in this game? What ethical or social problems is the game about, right? This is a game that's about a family, but everyone in the family is struggling with things that connect back to overarching ethical and social structures. This is a game very much about inherited trauma, about homophobia, and about the limitations of gender roles. Okay. So that's always something we want to be asking. And then what skills is the game asking us to master, right? In this game, you have to get really good at looking carefully at things. You can zip through the game for a while, just kind of touching things and looking, but you won't find the information you absolutely need for story progression unless you're very careful and methodical. So the game is actually really encouraging you to become a sort of detective. And it's asking you to think really carefully about maybe things that look like one thing but are actually another. Okay, so maybe not trusting your first assumption about stuff, which again relates back to the theme. And then how did the game setting, the house, the haunted house or the empty house in a storm is such a like overdetermined genre setting in our culture. So why this big empty creepy house in a storm? Like what does that do to us? How does it set us up for certain things in the game? The structures of the sort of more lived in parts of the house, and then the sort of less accessible parts of the house, the attic, the basement, the secret panels behind walls, right? As well as the items that we find and how they're designed to tell a story through not only print, but also sound, because we find a lot of music throughout the game. And I hope you're looking up this music because it actually is real historical music from the 90s. What does that tell us about the identities of the people who are listening to it? And then it's use of intertextuality. So how is it referencing things from our bigger world in to tell a story about power, culture, relationships between people? Okay. So how does all that help build the skills we need to complete the challenge of the game? Okay. So I'm going to enter a prompt for you over in the journal or the discussion section. Sorry. That's going to have a lot to do with what aspects of this game you think make it a queer game. The Shaw reading talks about how it's really just it's like a chronicling or a cataloging of all the queer representation in games, all the characters, right? LGBT characters, which there are not many, especially not main characters in games. They're sort of put off in side quests, and you can run into them, or if you pick certain dialogue, you'll discover they're gay or queer or trans or whatever. But there's no there are no AAA like major studio games with queer main characters for reasons, right? Because that would be too much for a straight audience to handle, right? Um, but remember, queer analysis isn't just about representation of characters. It's also about things like norms, design, mechanics, setting, right? What are the things about this game that even though we don't ever see a queer character, we don't ever engage with a queer character. We're hearing about Sam and Lonnie. And we see some pictures of them. We never meet them. We never meet anybody else, human and alive in this game. It's just voices and stories, right? So if there's no queer character, no animated queer character, is this a queer game? Why or why not? Right? I'll put a little bit more developed prompt around this question over in the discussion area for you. But I really want to see after, the opening sort of foundations unit, the unit on analyzing gender, sex, and race, and now having already worked with Bitch Planet a bit, I really want to see what you can do with this game in terms of your ability to build a reading, right? If there's queerness here, where is it in the game? Where is the queerness in Gone Home? Is it only in the story, or is it in more places than just that? Okay, so I really hope you enjoy this game. To answer this, you probably should try to finish the game. Like I said, feel free to kind of Fextra Life it or whatever, cheat to get what you need to find to finish it. Make sure to open every locked thing you find for all the story components. You'll know you've done that when you get a trophy pop, I think. Yeah, and then come back and talk about it, and I'll throw a prompt up. Also, be watching in my email for instructions about the midterm. Okay? All right. Hope you enjoy.